Hi, welcome. Enjoy the content, subscribe, and turn on notifications.
The silence in that house felt strange. It wasn't just the absence of sound. It was as if the air had gotten heavier, like the walls were silently watching something that had been lost. The hallways that used to be full of life now felt like long, empty tunnels where each step echoed as a reminder of what was missing. Every morning, Richard Miller walked through them with a tight knot in his stomach he tried to ignore. Before, there was constant noise. His kids' laughter echoing from upstairs, rushed footsteps running up and down the stairs, music blaring from their rooms, silly arguments about homework, video games, the TV volume, who would use the car that weekend. The house was full of voices, movement, life. But now, all of that had vanished like smoke. The kids grew up, as expected, and one by one they left. First Rachel, then Scott, and finally the youngest, Jeremy. Each goodbye came with suitcases by the door, tight hugs, and that forced smile parents make when they're trying to hide the fact that they're broken inside. Richard always thought he was prepared. He saw himself as a rational, objective man. A problem solver. Someone who took action, not someone who cried secretly in the bathroom. But something inside him shattered the moment Jeremy said, "Take care of yourself, Dad," before getting in the car and disappearing down the road, eyes sparkling with dreams and the future. That stuck with Richard. The phrase, so simple, so ordinary, weighed a ton. It was like, for the first time in years, he realized he also needed to be cared for. And the worst part, he had no idea where to start. At first, he tried the only way he knew how, throwing himself into his work. Miller Concretes was in its prime. The company that began with 2 trucks and a small team was now landing million-dollar contracts in multiple states. Richard was respected in his field. He knew the right names, was a master negotiator. If the phone kept ringing and emails never stopped, great. That was exactly what he needed so he wouldn't have to think. Vanessa, his wife of almost 3 decades, seemed to be on the same wavelength. She worked in advertising and had climbed high in her career. Always on the phone, always in meetings, always connected. Sometimes, he'd watch her from a distance, pacing around the living room with the phone to her ear, eyes glued to a spreadsheet, and wonder if she felt as lost as he did. But he never asked. They weren't the type of couple who talked about their feelings. Their marriage had always been built on respect, partnership, and a certain predictability. They weren't romantic. They didn't do big gestures. But it worked. At least, Richard believed so. He thought the silence that now filled the house was natural. A new stage in life. Something all couples go through, then move on. But the truth was, as the days passed, he started feeling a strange discomfort. A feeling that something was out of place. The routine that used to be his safe haven began to feel like a prison. He'd wake up, have breakfast practically alone, Vanessa usually left early, go to the office, solve everything that needed solving, come home, often eat dinner in silence, and watch TV just to fill the time until he fell asleep. There was one particular night that Richard never forgot. He decided to come home early. Unusual, since he usually stayed late doing reports. But that Tuesday, for no special reason, he left the office at 5, stopped at the market, and bought ingredients for Vanessa's favorite dish, lemon chicken with jasmine rice and sautéed vegetables. He wasn't a chef, but he gave it his best. He set the table with 2 plates, even lit a candle, something he hadn't done in years. He waited with an anxiety he didn't recognize anymore. He heard every car passing on the street, imagining each one was hers. When she finally opened the door, his heart actually sped up. But her reaction was too quick. She didn't even notice the set table. She took off her shoes absent-mindedly, still on the phone. "I ate at the office, honey." It was a hectic day, she said, almost like an automatic apology, before rushing upstairs. Richard stayed there, staring at the hot plates, the flickering candle, the silent screaming. He couldn't describe what he felt. It wasn't anger. It wasn't sadness. It was a kind of emptiness that had no name. Like something inside him had finally shut down. But he didn't complain. Didn't argue. Didn't even bring up the dinner the next day. He tucked it all away in silence, like he did with things he didn't know how to handle. Telling himself she was just tired was easier. That life was like that. That love changes over time. That long marriages go through phases. He chose to believe those pre-packaged truths. Chose not to think too much. He kept sticking to his schedule, answering emails, signing contracts, planning expansions. Meanwhile, the hole inside him just kept growing. Vanessa, on the other hand, seemed more and more distant. Their interactions turned into brief passings in the kitchen, short conversations in the hallway, text messages throughout the day that felt more like calendar updates than actual exchanges of affection. Richard realized they were becoming strangers who slept in the same bed. Sharing a roof, but not a life. And still, he asked no questions. He didn't create situations. He didn't open up. Partly because he didn't want to see what was right in front of him. Partly because he believed that if he pretended things were normal long enough, maybe normal would really return. But what he didn't know was that while he was trying to keep that structure from falling apart, while he was pretending the absence of emotion was just another phase, a silent gear had already started to turn. Something invisible but real. Something that had no return. And he was about to see everything he thought was solid come crashing down. He woke up that morning feeling something different. It was subtle, almost unnoticeable, like a breeze before the storm. He got up at the usual time, went through the same motions as always, shower, pressed shirt, black coffee made precisely the same way. But there was a restlessness in him he couldn't explain. Like something inside was knocking, asking to be let in. The day was bright, no clouds. Traffic was flowing slowly, just another weekday. He knew that route like the back of his hand, every stoplight, every intersection, every engine noise echoing through the avenues. Still, as he approached the curve that led straight to his office, Richard turned the wheel the other way. A sudden choice, no reason, no specific destination. He just kept going. As he drove down quieter streets, he began to notice things he hadn't paid attention to in a long time. The color of the trees lining the sidewalk, the sunlight reflecting in shop windows, couples walking hand in hand. It felt like the whole city was breathing differently. Or maybe he was the one trying to learn how to breathe again. That's when he saw the cafe. Small, unassuming, with a dark wooden facade and big windows. Nothing flashy, but something about it drew him in. A hand-painted sign said, "Fresh ground coffee, fresh bread all day." It was an unspoken invitation. A kind of refuge for anyone who needed silence but also warmth. He parked and went in. The little bell above the door rang softly, as if the place were asking everyone to speak quietly. The smell of freshly brewed coffee mixed with bread straight out of the oven, creating an atmosphere that felt almost therapeutic. Wooden tables, tiny vases with flowers, hanging lights with a warm glow, everything there seemed ready to embrace you. Richard ordered a double espresso and picked a table by the window. He just wanted to watch the world for a few minutes. Let time slip by without hurry or obligations. There was something liberating about that pause, like he was finally giving himself attention after ignoring his own needs for so long. He was glancing toward the back of the cafe, between plants and shelves, when his heart seemed to skip a beat. His blood felt like it was moving in slow motion. Sitting at a more private table was Vanessa. She had her hair in a perfect bun, wearing a sleek navy blazer, discreet earrings catching the soft light. Her posture, her smile, everything about her was meticulously put together, like always. But what caught Richard's eye even more was that she wasn't alone. Across from her sat a good-looking man, trimmed beard, wearing a light-colored shirt with the sleeves rolled up to his elbows. They were laughing. Their conversation looked easy, intimate. There was a natural flow between them. No awkwardness, no hesitation. Like they'd met up many times before. Richard shrank back in his chair, instinctively trying to stay in the shadows. He watched. Every detail. Every nuance. The way she tilted her head slightly to listen better, how her eyes smiled, how her fingers drifted to the edge of her cup and then rested on the table, too close to the man's hand. A touch here. A quiet laugh there. It looked nothing like a work meeting. Vanessa hated simple places. She was a fan of fancy bistros, rooftop restaurants, lounges with foreign-sounding names. And yet, there she was, in a cozy, low-key cafe where nobody paid attention to anyone else. Richard bit his lip hard. He still wanted to believe there was some explanation. That it was just another misunderstanding in a chain of misunderstandings. But then their body language became even clearer. She reached out, and naturally wrapped her hands around his. A gentle gesture. Warm. Like she wanted to soothe him, comfort him, or love him. It was like a crack running through concrete. It didn't make a sound, but it was deep and final. His heart felt heavy. His hand shook around the now cold cup. His eyes looked for a way out, but the reality was right there in front of him, alive, concrete, undeniable. And as if all that wasn't enough, he heard the words. Vanessa smirked with a hint of mischief and said, "I avoid any contact at home. That way he still thinks everything's normal." They hit Richard's chest like a punch. The words echoed in his mind as if they'd been shouted through a loudspeaker. It wasn't just a casual meeting. It was strategy. She was keeping him at a distance on purpose. She built those walls intentionally. She did it knowing he'd never find out. At that moment, everything changed. The cozy cafe suddenly felt like a theater of silent horrors. The soft lights turned cruel. People laughing at other tables seemed to mock him. Richard's heart, once full of doubt, now pounded with something new, clarity. And even as he stood there, he stayed quiet. His face was expressionless, but inside he was erupting. Every part of him wanted to react, get up, confront them. But something deeper spoke louder. It was his turn to play now. No one there had any idea what Richard Miller was capable of once he decided to act. That night, Richard barely slept. The wide, comfortable bed felt like a battlefield of relentless thoughts. The pillow got too hot after a few minutes, so he'd flip it, adjust it, try to relax. But the moment he shut his eyes, the images replayed as though they were etched on the back of his eyelids: Vanessa's smile, her touch on another man's arm, that intimate look, the words whispered in that almost mocking tone. He turned toward her side of the bed. She was there, asleep, her face turned to the wall. She seemed peaceful, oblivious to the fact that the ground under them was starting to crack. Richard lay still, breathing slowly, waiting for his own heart to accept this new reality. It wasn't just the pain of betrayal, it was the bitter realization that the solid world he thought he had was already crumbling. He'd just been pretending not to see. But that night, something began to shift. For the first time in years, he stopped feeling like a spectator in his own life. He didn't know exactly what he'd do, but he was sure of one thing: he wasn't going to let himself be treated as disposable, like some invisible fool. The pain had been the final push, but what would follow was driven by another force, one he'd buried a long time ago: self-love. In the days that followed, Vanessa continued her routine. Same hours, same excuses, the same coldness disguised as fatigue. Richard, however, started acting differently. It began with his schedule. He got up earlier, had breakfast before she came downstairs, and went out for a run through the neighborhood. He'd quit running years ago, but those first miles, even though his legs were heavy and his lungs burned, gave him a feeling he hardly recognized anymore: freedom. Sweat ran down his face, the sound of his shoes hitting the pavement, the cold air in his lungs, it all seemed to cleanse not just his body but his mind. He ran like he was running away from that old version of himself. And little by little, that version was left behind. After his run, a hot shower became a sort of rebirth ritual. The bathroom mirror reflected a man who looked more alive, more determined. His tired expression gave way to signs of resolve. He got a haircut, changed up his wardrobe, started using colognes he'd stashed away in a drawer. When he began going to a gym near the office, he felt the initial awkwardness of someone starting over after a long time. But that didn't stop him. There was something therapeutic about each weight he lifted, each rep that made his muscles burn. With every bead of sweat, it was like he was sculpting not only his body but a new identity. In that new setting, he crossed paths with people outside his usual social circle. Among them was a woman who caught his attention effortlessly. She was on the treadmill next to his on a rainy Wednesday morning, sweating, out of breath, but totally focused. Her face showed something familiar, not because of her features, but because of the emotion in her eyes, emotional exhaustion. Later, they ended up in the weight area together. She tried lifting a weight that was obviously too heavy. He noticed her body falter for a second, and without thinking, he stepped in, stabilized the equipment, and kept her from losing her balance. "Thank you," she said, taking a deep breath and grabbing a towel. "I think you picked up more than you should," he replied with a faint smile. "Maybe. But bad days make me want intense distractions." Her words stuck with him all day. It felt like they recognized something in each other without needing to explain. Her name was Charlotte. She was a physical therapist, mother of a teenager, recently divorced. Over short chats in the following days, they discovered little things in common, liking jazz, a love for old books, a habit of watching people as if they were characters in a novel. Charlotte had a quiet strength. She was kind, but there was a firmness in the way she spoke. Richard could tell there was pain beneath her calm surface, and one day, without asking for details, he commented that sometimes losing something is the only way we rediscover ourselves. She looked into his eyes and said, with a sincerity that didn't need drama, "The part that hurts the most isn't the end. It's realizing the other person lied for so long while you kept telling yourself everything was okay." Those words struck him hard. She'd been through the same thing. The difference was that she was a few steps ahead in her own rebuilding process. Maybe that's why each encounter with Charlotte gave him a sense of silent support. No pressures, no hints. Just someone with whom he could be himself, no filters, no shields, no need to pretend he had everything under control. Meanwhile, at home, Vanessa started noticing these changes in him. At first, she shrugged them off. Maybe she thought it was just a midlife crisis. A passing phase. But as the days went by, she noticed something deeper. Richard's gaze had changed. There was a spark where before there was emptiness. Confidence where before there was routine. She began watching him more carefully. She tried to hide it, but he noticed. She started asking casual questions. "Where are you going after work? Are you meeting someone from the office? You've got a new cologne?" He answered calmly, keeping it vague, leaving room for her imagination to fill in the blanks. During dinners with friends, Vanessa made a point to touch him more often, laugh at his jokes, and bring back gestures that had been dormant for years. But it was all mechanical, like a last-minute performance by someone who finally realized she was losing control of the narrative. Richard wasn't swayed. There was something stronger guiding his steps now. He no longer searched for answers in her actions. He didn't need that anymore. He'd discovered something better, the ability to find value in himself, to reclaim his desires, to tend to what he'd neglected for so long. And in that silent rebuilding, a new Richard was emerging. Lighter, stronger, more aware. And, above all, more ready. Because while Vanessa got tangled up in her own lies, Richard was moving toward the truth. And he was about to show that underestimating a quiet man is the most dangerous mistake anyone can make. It was a night with no special dates, no anniversaries, no obvious reasons. just a random Wednesday that would have gone unnoticed. Vanessa got home around 7, as usual, kicked off her shoes at the door, left her purse on the console table, and headed straight to the kitchen to pour herself a glass of wine. She was so used to the routine, to Richard's predictability, that at first she didn't notice the changes he'd carefully put in place that day. The dining table was set with an elegance she hadn't seen in ages. Cloth napkins, perfectly aligned silverware, a bottle of wine from the cellar that they usually only opened for special occasions. There was also a simple flower arrangement in the center of the table, nothing fancy, but done with care. The kind of gesture that requires intention. Vanessa frowned, confused, but before she could say anything, Richard appeared, wearing a dark shirt and a calm look, with a slight smile on his face. "I thought we could have a night out without actually going out," he said, pulling out a chair for her. She sat, hesitant, trying not to show how thrown off she was. This kind of attention wasn't typical. She tried to go along with it, laughed softly, talked about a difficult client at work, but avoided straight questions. Richard, on the other hand, seemed at ease. He steered the conversation like someone savoring a glass of wine, slowly, unhurried, letting the silence do some of the talking. During dinner, he shared some old memories she'd all but forgotten. Small things, like a trip they took back when they were newly married, getting lost on the road and ending up at a roadside diner that served the best garlic bread they'd ever tasted. She smiled awkwardly, like someone trying to follow a trail that had long since faded. When they finished the main course and the waiter, hired for that night, took away the plates, Richard made a slight gesture with his hand and said, "You know, I've been thinking a lot about what we built together. About everything we've been through. And I've come to a conclusion." Vanessa sat up straighter. She recognized that tone. It was the one he used in important meetings, right before pitching an unrefusable offer. "I realize that what matters most to me," he went on, "is preserving what we've built. And for that, we need something clear. A pact." From inside his jacket, he took out a white envelope. He slid it across the table. She looked at it like it might be a gift or some sort of formal invitation. She opened it, unsure, and found a contract inside. Letterhead, well-organized clauses, a lawyer's signature at the end. "An agreement?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady. "Yes." Simple and direct. "If one of us cheats, lies, or breaks the other's trust, everything we own automatically transfers to the other person." She took a few seconds to process that. Her face, usually so composed for clients and tough situations, looked unguarded for the first time. Her eyes blinked faster, her breathing shifted just a bit. She leaned back, trying to regain control. "This is a joke, right? You know me. I don't do this kind of thing for fun. There's no trick here, Vanessa. It's just protection. A reminder that trust has value," he said, voice soft but firm, staring straight into her eyes. She leaned back, forcing a laugh, and took a sip of wine with her left hand while flipping through the pages with her right. She glanced at some of the clauses, shaking her head, probably waiting for him to say, "I'm kidding," or, "It was just to get your attention." But his expression didn't change. "Why now?" she asked, almost whispering. "Because I realized it's never too soon to strengthen what's important. And if you have nothing to worry about, this doesn't change anything." It was a straightforward argument, almost impossible to dispute. Signing meant showing good faith. Refusing would raise suspicions. And in that moment, she needed to maintain the appearance of normalcy. Richard motioned to the waiter, who reappeared with an elegant pen. Vanessa hesitated, lightly biting her lower lip, and took a deep breath. A storm was raging in her head, but outwardly, she managed a short, almost mechanical smile. "Fine. Let's show how mature we are, then." She signed. Her signature was steady, but her gaze was scattered. When she slid the papers back to him, she tried to sound casual, "There. Now we're protected. Richard placed the contract back in the envelope and returned it to his pocket with the utmost care, like a precious artifact. Then he simply smiled and raised his glass. "To what we've built," he said. She followed suit, and the chime of crystal filled the room for a moment. They toasted like a couple renewing their vows. What Vanessa didn't realize was that, in that raised glass, there was more than elegance. It was the first step in a carefully crafted plan. Richard didn't show anything on his face. He kept the conversation going as usual, finished dinner with a light dessert, thanked the waiter, and walked Vanessa to the car, even holding the door for her. The evening ended calmly, like a scene from a romantic movie, until he turned the key and started the engine. In the quiet of the car, with the city lights reflecting on the windshield, he didn't need to say another word. Because, deep down, he already knew, the game had begun, and Vanessa had just handed over the only advantage she had. The next morning, Richard woke up before his alarm. The sky was still dark, but his thoughts were already bright, putting each move together like a silent conductor before a big performance. The dinner from the night before still echoed in his mind, not as something romantic or sentimental, but as the moment the final piece of his strategy clicked into place. Vanessa, on the other hand, acted like everything was normal. She gave him a quick peck on the cheek before leaving for work, praised the dinner in a forced tone, and complimented the wine with a sort of scripted excitement. She seemed to think she was back on top, that by signing that contract she'd fixed the issue and regained control. But Richard knew that was just a facade. That false security was exactly what he needed her to keep believing. The more confident she felt, the weaker she'd be when the impact came. In this situation, confidence was glass about to shatter. And he was holding the stone. During the week, Richard stuck to his schedule meticulously. He arrived at work at the same time, greeted employees with the same reserved smile, attended meetings as always. Only one thing had changed, the way he watched everything around him. Every gesture of Vanessa's, every time she said she had a meeting, every outfit change before she left the house. He absorbed all the details like a silent detective, storing tiny bits of evidence in a mental drawer that was already overflowing. One morning, while she was rushing out the door saying she had a full day of presentations, Richard tilted his head slightly and smiled calmly. "Good luck. Make the most of your day." She gave him a curious look, maybe surprised by his composure, and then left. As soon as the door closed, Richard went upstairs to the bedroom, opened the drawer of the dresser, and took out the envelope containing the signed contract. He ran his fingers over Vanessa's signature as if to confirm it was real. A simple piece of paper now had the power to completely rewrite their story. He knew that to make his next move, he had to be extra careful. One slip, and he'd lose the effect of what was about to happen. That's when he had the final idea, a fake trip. Something simple, believable, and impossible to question, a business trip. On Friday morning, during breakfast, he mentioned casually, something came up last minute. 2 important meetings in Atlanta. I'll leave Monday and come back on Wednesday. Vanessa pretended not to be bothered, but her eyes lit up for just a second. It was subtle, but there. That was her perfect window to keep doing what she thought she was hiding. The stage was set. Sunday night, he neatly packed a suitcase, placed his leather briefcase beside it, and left a printed plane ticket on the table. Vanessa said, "Have a good trip," and gave him a kiss that, to an untrained observer, would seem normal. But to Richard, it tasted like a lie. He followed through. On Monday morning, he left at the agreed time, drove to a side street, parked between 2 vans, and waited. Time ticked by slowly. The car engine was off, the breeze faintly hitting the windshield, thoughts pounding in his head. He knew this was the point of no return. Right here, right now, their fate was being decided. Then, less than an hour later, Jason's car pulled up to the house. Richard watched as if he were watching a play with a script he knew by heart. Jason got out confidently, wearing a dark polo, well-fitted jeans, holding what looked like a bottle of wine. He walked up to the door with sure steps, glanced around out of habit, and rang the doorbell. Vanessa answered within seconds. Her hair was down, makeup subtle, wearing a short dress and a smile Richard hadn't seen in years. She opened the door quickly, pulled Jason inside, and shut it behind them like she was hiding something valuable. Richard closed his eyes for a moment. Not out of pain or rage, but to focus on what was next. He picked up his phone and made 2 calls. The first was to his lawyer, who was standing by. The second was to Brooke, Jason's wife, whom he'd met a few weeks before thanks to a shared professional contact. One conversation was all it took for the picture to become crystal clear. At the arranged time, Richard got out of the car and calmly walked toward the house. He had the key in his pocket, his heart steady, and the certainty that it was time to wrap this up. He turned the lock as easily as if he had no fear. He stepped through the hallway in silence, listening to muffled laughter upstairs. He climbed the stairs one at a time, phone in hand to record everything, his footsteps slow, hearing the floor creak beneath him. He stopped at the bedroom door. He opened it without hurrying. There they were. The instant Vanessa's eyes met his was pure panic. Jason grabbed for the sheets, desperate to hide. But there were no shouts or confrontations. Just the cold silence of an exposed truth. Richard stood there for a few seconds. His expression was calm, his face unreadable. He took in their shock like someone watching the collapse of an empire that had too many cracks. Then he turned and walked back downstairs, unhurried, as if he'd done it before in some distant dream. At the front door, he found his lawyer waiting with a folder. He handed over the documents and gave a slight nod. The lawyer understood. Richard stayed in the doorway as Vanessa, now in just a robe, raced down the stairs, eyes wide with panic. "Did you call someone?" Her voice trembled. Richard held out his hand toward the folder. "These are the divorce papers. And since you signed that contract, everything we own now belongs to me." She was too stunned to move. Her body seemed locked in place, her breathing shallow, her eyes darting between the paperwork and his face. She wanted to speak, but there were no words that fit. And then another person appeared at the door. Brooke, calm, holding a key in her hand, standing with the dignity of someone who knows her own worth. She looked at Jason, who came down the stairs behind Vanessa, still trying to figure out how things had spiraled out of his control. Brooke took a deep breath and said, "I suspected. Now I know." Jason took a step forward, hands raised like he was begging for a chance to explain, but Brooke cut him off by tossing the key on the floor. "Come by the house just to get your stuff. You've lost more than you realize." She turned and walked to her car without looking back. Vanessa, now pale, tried to approach Richard, muttering some half apology, half plea, but he never moved. He passed the folder to his lawyer and spoke calmly, "Take care of the rest, and do me a favor, give her 1 hour to get out of my house." Then he walked out, stepped through the door, and headed to his car with light, steady steps. That weight he'd carried for so long was gone. On the sidewalk, as the wind whispered through the trees, Richard Miller breathed in, opened the car door, got in, started the engine, and drove away. There was no rush, no fear, no more lies. Only peace. The real kind. The kind that only arrives when the truth finally has a voice. Night settled over the city like a heavy blanket. Outside, neon signs flashed red and blue across the hotel room's window, like they were announcing a tragedy. Vanessa sat on the edge of the bed staring into space, fingers clasped in her lap, legs shaking. Jason paced back and forth with his hands on his head, like he was trapped in his own guilt. Neither of them could sleep. "I lost everything," she whispered, barely making a sound, like she was only talking to herself. Jason stopped, turned to face her slowly. "What do you mean, everything? You're a millionaire, Vanessa. You've got a company, a house, cars. How could you lose everything?" She lifted her eyes, filled with tears, and let out the words with more weight than she could handle. A few days ago, Richard made me sign a document. It seemed symbolic, silly. It was about trust. If I cheated on him, I'd give up everything we built. I signed. Her voice broke. I just signed. Jason's eyes went wide with disbelief. How could you sign something like that without reading it? Without thinking? I thought it was just some gimmick on his part. He's always been quiet, rational, reserved. I figured he was trying to save the marriage. I thought I was still in control. She pressed her hands to her face as if trying to wake up from a nightmare. My God, what about my kids? How am I going to explain that I lost everything because of a stupid choice? Jason sighed and dropped into the armchair in the corner of the room. There were no words left to fix this. Nothing would change the damage. The truth was out, and it was final. Meanwhile, across town, Richard's phone buzzed on a nightstand. He was in a discreet hotel where he planned to stay just long enough to give everyone space to react. He answered with a calm, "Hello." On the other end, his lawyer spoke clearly, "Mr. Miller, she's already left the property. Everything's in order. You can go back whenever you like." Richard looked at the clock, took a deep breath, thanked him, and hung up. He stood, took his blazer off the back of the chair, adjusted his shirt collar, and left the room with confident steps. The drive back was quiet, the radio off, the car gliding through city streets like the world was slowing down to match his pace. When he turned onto his street, he saw the house in the distance, imposing, yet different now. For the first time in a long while, it actually felt like it was his. He parked, turned off the engine, and sat there for a moment inside the car, looking at the house. He took a deep breath, stepped out, opened the gate, crossed the yard, and turned the key in the door, feeling both relief and closure. Once inside, he found everything still and quiet. Everything neat, orderly, and free from the presence that had weighed on him for so long. He walked through the living room, the kitchen, ran his hand over the back of the couch. Each object felt like it had returned to its rightful place. The home, finally, felt like a refuge again, not a stage for deception. He went upstairs, changed clothes, and sat in the armchair by the window. The sky was clear. A gentle wind rustled the street's trees. He picked up his phone and paused a moment before making the call. "Hey, Rachel. Everything okay over there?" His daughter answered with a slight edge of worry in her voice. "Yeah, Dad, is something wrong?" "Yes. I needed to tell you." Honestly, without sugarcoating anything. He told her everything. Calmly, without hate or drama. He explained that Vanessa had made bad choices, that he found out, that he handled it smartly, not violently. He talked about the contract, about what was at stake, and why he did what he did. She was silent on the other end, then he heard her breathing, and finally she replied, "I knew something was off between you two. Thank you for trusting me, Dad. I love you. I'm here for you." Richard smiled, tears brimming in his eyes. He hung up, then called Scott, and then Jeremy, having the same honest, tough, liberating conversation with each of them. And that night, after so long, Richard slept soundly. No fear of waking up. No masks around him. No pretending to be happy. Because the truth, even when it hurts, is the only path to real peace. Thank you for watching the video. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you won't miss any updates. See you next time.